introduce another dynamic leader this morning. I'm so pleased to welcome President Yong because, first of all, I want to welcome him home to Iowa. I always get a lot of reaction when I explain to people that President Kim's an Iowan from Muscatine, and then when I know that he played quarterback on the Muskies football team, that gets a reaction as well. But President Kim is really in many ways uniquely suited for this moment of food becoming medicine because he's a medical doctor, a PhD. He's worked at the World Health Organization on AIDS and seen the devastation there. We focused in our symposium on that 10 years ago. On that. In addition, from my work over the last 50 years, beginning in Vietnam, I've seen the importance of infrastructure and what that means, because the lesson I know is nutrition and health travels down a paved road. And finally, I want to note that the position of President of the World Bank is one that exerts incredible leadership in moments of crisis. You heard yesterday from our panels on national security and conflict and trend lines that there's going to be other crises coming. And our international political system isn't really so well structured for dealing with that. And so it's then that you have positions like Josette Sheeran and Catherine Bertini occupied at the World Food Program. You have individuals like President Akinwumi Adesina occupies at the African Development Bank. And then you have the leadership that will come from the President of the World Bank to ease panic, bring control, bring assurances of what's possible. So that's why it is so marvelous to have with us this morning President Yong Kim.
Thanks so much, everybody. It's great to be here. My good friend Akin, he's, let me tell you, he's now the new president of the African Development Bank, and I've never been more optimistic about what we can do together in Africa to have somebody who understands agriculture, understands economics, working with me. And Ken, thank you so much. It's great to be back in Iowa. I usually say most people can tell just by looking at me that I'm from Iowa. And, I've heard that story a lot, that I was a high school quarterback. But the year that I was quarterback, we lost every single game, which extended our losing streak to 56 games in a row, Muscatine. Now, since then, Muscatine Muskies have won the state championship, I understand. So it was really getting rid of the likes of me that got the football program going. I'm here for a very specific purpose. And the reason I came here is because I need your help. Akin and I need your help. I'm going to talk to you today about what I think is perhaps the greatest stain on the consciousness of the world today, and it is directly related to the work that all of you do. Now, hunger among children is something that moved Norman Borlaug. And, as I was preparing, I read a lot about Dr. Borlaug. First of all, his family moved to Iowa, his great-grandparents, to a town called Saúde, which in Portuguese means health. And it was right near Cresco, Iowa. And Cresco is the Latin term for I grow. Right? So this man was destined for great things from the time of his great-grandparents. My parents came to the United States first exactly 100 years later, in 1954. And I ended up growing up in not just Muscatine, but I also spent a couple of years in a place called State Center, Iowa, a town of about 2,000 people just a little ways away from here. Now, Norman Borlaug was a visionary, and he applied science to the problems of the world in a way that revolutionized what we do today. But I want to give you a glimpse of what I think the world is going to look like, and it scares me. It's very exciting in a way, but for poor people in poor countries, we have to think hard about what it's going to mean. A good friend of mine, Klaus Schwab, who's the head of the World Economic Forum, wrote a book called The Fourth Industrial Revolution. And in it, he argued that things like automation, artificial intelligence, robotics, were going to revolutionize the world. And it was going to revolutionize the world in ways that I think are very worrisome for some. When we look at increasing productivity, and that's the big problem right now. One of the reasons that economic growth has been so slow is because productivity has not been increasing. Many people look at automation, robotics, artificial intelligence as a way of increasing productivity, but it's an increase in productivity that is not job rich, and in many ways is job killing. And so if you think about what's going to happen to the currently existing jobs in developing countries, this is what it looks like. And this is according to our World Bank data. 65% of jobs in Nigeria will be gone, 77% in China. Now, China is relatively prepared. I was just in China at the G20 leaders meeting, and President Xi just casually mentioned to us that 1/4 of all engineers live in China. He has 900 million workers, 150 million of whom have degrees in engineering or some other applied science. China is relatively prepared, but is India prepared at 69%? India has 38% childhood stunting, which I'll talk about in a bit. Ethiopia will lose 85% of its jobs. So if this is happening, if low-skilled agricultural jobs and light manufacturing are not going to be an option, if the traditional path toward economic growth, which has been increased productivity of agriculture, light manufacturing, and then full-scale industrialization, if that path is not open to perhaps the majority of developing countries, what are people going to do? There's a lot of talk that what may happen in developing countries is that you'll move directly from an agricultural economy right to a service-oriented economy. Well, if that's what you're going to do, then you're going to need every single brain cell, every single neuronal connection. You're going to have to be able to learn throughout your entire life. You're going to have to reach a level of digital competency that quite literally, very few of us, probably even in this room, have yet to achieve. I'm looking around the room. I don't see a lot of digital natives. Most of us are digital immigrants. But you're going to have digital nativity from an early age, and you're going to have to learn and think in that way. So competing in the new economy is now how should I say it? It's the reason now that we have to rethink investing in the early years in a fundamental way. India has 38.7% childhood stunting, and we have overwhelming data that said that children are stunted, have as much as 40% less brain volume, do not learn as well, do not earn as much later. Pakistan, 45% childhood stunting. Indonesia, 37% childhood stunting. Each of those countries I've gone and I've visited and I've talked to their leaders and I've said, you have an emergency on your hands. You cannot rely on low-skilled agriculture and manufacturing jobs to absorb this workforce that is going to be stunted, literally, as they go into their later years. You cannot afford to walk into the future with that kind of workforce. We now know much more, certainly than I think Norman Borlaug knew this in his heart, that there was something going on with malnutrition that he had to address. But now we know much, much more. Literally, the number of neuronal connections that children make in the first 1,000 days is stunted. That's what gets stunted. Now, we talk a lot in economics about human capital. Human capital is literally neuronal connections. It's literally what you've learned, and as you learn, you create these neuronal connections. And this is the difference over the first 1,000 days. This is the rates of stunting in the world. So all the red colors are countries that have more than 30% stunting. Right? And look at all of South Asia. What are we going to do? What are we going to do if you have 30 to 40% of your population unable to learn, unable to participate in what will be an increasingly digital economy? What's going to happen? We saw that with the Syrian crisis, the flow of refugees presented an existential threat to Europe. And right now, we have not worked at the World Bank on refugee crises before. We're not short-term responders. But the donor countries, especially the European countries, have implored us to get involved, and now we're very involved in forced displacement. We're now trying to create jobs in Jordan for Syrian refugees in the middle of these crises, because the flow of refugees, which was at relatively small levels compared to the rest of the world, because close to 90% of all refugees are still in developing countries. It was a relatively small proportion of global refugees, but it presented an existential threat in the minds of European leaders. Therefore, we're involved. What's going to happen in those countries? What's going to happen in those countries if we don't have these low-skilled agricultural jobs? What's going to happen if light manufacturing never reaches them? If it were just nutrition, that would be great. But you can be fully nourished, and if you don't have access to pre-primary education, you're also in trouble. Stunting is a physical measure. We have done studies. The World Health Organization did a global study and found, with a very broad cross-section, they found that every child in the world is capable of growing 25 centimeters in the first year and 12 centimeters in the second. Now, in one country that I went to, I said, you have a real problem with stunting. And they said, no, that's not right. The people of my country are just shorter. I want everyone to know that that's just not true, right? We have studied everybody. Everyone can grow 25 centimeters in the first year, 12 centimeters in the second. But it turns out that if you also don't get stimulation, if you don't get the right kind of stimulation, even if you are appropriate height for age, you still are incapable of learning effectively. Now, here's the really disturbing data. The Lancet Medical Journal just did a study on not just stunting, but the number of children in the world that will not be able to reach their full potential because of a combination of malnutrition, lack of early stimulation, poor schooling, exposure to toxic environments. Exposure to toxic environments is the other major, the other major risk for not developing fully. It turns out that if you're in a stressful, toxic environment, you produce glucocorticoids at a much higher level, and the nature of the expression of the genetic material changes, and you start expressing those genes that produce glucocorticoids at a higher level, and higher levels of circulating glucocorticoids depress the formation of neuronal connections. So we now know what's happening. We know it very clearly, and only half of 3 to 6 year olds get the kind of pre-primary education that will allow them to learn fully. The word gap by age 3 from economically disadvantaged and economically advantaged children is almost double. 1,100 words among those who are economically advantaged, 500 for those who are not. The stress is this issue. 1 in 200 children in the world is a refugee. 1 in 8 migrants in the world is a child. 28 million children have been displaced by violence. We know, and it's now extremely clear, that when we talk about investing in children, this is not something that we're saying just to be nice people. This is not something that we're saying is simply a moral issue. This is an issue that gets right at the core of economic growth, and that's the argument I'm making to ministers of finance and heads of state. But far beyond that, at the G20, where the most powerful leaders in the world come to meet, the point we're making is if you don't do that, the refugee crisis that we've seen could pale in comparison to what we see in the future with so many young people coming onto the job market unable to compete. So we have to make sure that children reach their full potential. And I would argue that this is one of the great, great moral issues of our time, that we can do this. We can ensure that children have good nutrition in the first 1,000 days, early stimulation and learning activities, and are nurtured and protected from these stressful, toxic environments. Now, I don't think I would be as aggressive about putting pressure on leaders of these countries if we didn't have such a good example in Peru. Now, let me get nerdy here for just a moment, because it matters, right? So I've worked in Peru for many years, and I watched them over many decades struggle to try to bring down childhood stunting. And it was at 30%. This goes back to the year 2000. It's so hard to see. It goes back to the year 2000, But it goes back much before that. I started working there in the early 1990s, but it goes back to the 70s. That through all kinds of what we call supply-side interventions, you can have special support for your child. You can have them weighed and measured. You can come to the clinic. There are special programs where you can increase their nutrition. Through supply-side interventions, that number did not budge. We could not get that number to budge. And then one of our brilliant economists at the World Bank saw that a certain country in Latin America was not going to use the money that had been allotted for that country. So that we thought, well, why not, look, we've just been struggling with this forever. Why don't we give it a shot? Why don't we try a demand-side intervention? And a demand-side intervention in this case is pretty straightforward. It's called a conditional cash transfer. Conditional cash transfers have been shown to work brilliantly all over the world. And it's a pretty straightforward idea. It's you give poor people money. But you give poor people money and you say that you'll get the next month's tranche if you do these things for your family. And so we took this money and just did an experiment. We gave money to the mothers of children who either were stunted or were at risk of being stunted. And the number went from 28% to 14% in just 7 years. We've never seen an advance like that. And it's like, we should have thought of this before. What a brilliant idea. People are living in abject poverty, give them money. And I tell you, Akin knows this well, okay? Akin knows this well. There was a strong ideological bent against doing that in the World Bank Group. When I came to the World Bank Group for the first time, I couldn't believe how many studies we'd done of conditional cash transfers. And I said, why have we studied this so much? And people said, because it was controversial. And it went against our fundamental notions. You can't solve poverty by giving people money. I thought, well, that's exactly how you solve poverty. But it turns out that the conditionality was really key in some countries. But then we've known, and former President Bandes here in Malawi, we did unconditional cash transfers, and they work just as well. They work just as well. So we now know that if you pair a supply-side intervention with a demand-side intervention, you can get results very, very quickly. So now, the World Bank, we've really gone through a lot of change to try to make sure that every single country in the world is going to be learning from every other country in the world. We have the experts from the Peruvian project working in Pakistan, working in Indonesia right now, trying to bring about these same results in a short period of time. So it's a broad agenda. Women's education empowerment is critical. Quality reproductive and health services is critical. Diverse and affordable food is critical. Water and sanitation, safety nets, these things are all critical. They're good for these countries anyway. We've got to focus on this. And again, the difference now is that it's not just a moral argument. It's not just a nutrition argument. It's an argument about the fundamental stability of societies and actually the world. So let me, many of you know Jürgen Vogeli. Everything I know about agriculture, I learned from Jürgen. I continue to learn from him. And I've learned a lot, and I am going to tentatively and humbly make a few suggestions about the things that we could work on together. So the first is that we think the food system can actually be a huge part of fighting childhood stunting by boosting incomes, empowering women, and providing for more diverse diets. There's been so much that you've done already, but we humbly suggest that there are other things that we can do, including, and this is controversial, we know, really rethinking how we use agricultural subsidies. Now, it's very hard. All of you who've worked in this field know that it's very hard to convince countries to remove agricultural subsidies. We're trying very hard to convince countries to remove fuel subsidies. That seems like a clear no-brainer. But so many countries want to continue to provide subsidies because it gives them some sense of protecting themselves, food security, et cetera, et cetera. But the things that we'd like to focus on is to eliminate the staple grain bias, that so many of the food subsidies are focused on staple grains. We'd like to see countries focus more on diverse diets, fruits and vegetables, for instance, and invest in the kind of sustainable outcomes that we know can happen, especially in the context of climate change. Now, this is another area that we're very involved in, that we haven't been involved in historically, which is climate change. And again, I think that climate change presents an existential threat. An existential threat in the sense that if you just look at August of 2016, and many of you may know that the COP21, which I participated in, and for which now the World Bank Group is the largest donor. We are now the largest donor to climate change activities. And by 2020, our annual contributions will reach close to $30 billion a year. So we have now moved quite a bit away from being the enemy of the environmental community, and we're now the largest donor. But if you look just at August of 2016, August of 2016 was close to 1.3 degrees Celsius above historic norms. And if you know the COP21 agreement, the agreement was to keep it below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So you can't make assumptions based on 1 month. But up to August of 2016, every single one of the 16 months leading up to August 16 was the hottest month on record. So things are happening now that have not been happening before. And for us, all of you in the agricultural community, those of us who work on agriculture, we have an opportunity. Because there is, as Jürgen has taught me, the triple win. We can increase productivity, enhance resilience, and reduce emissions. Bill Gates is a person I work with very, very closely, and he says it very simply. The great thing about climate-smart agriculture is that more productive agriculture and climate-smart agriculture overlap beautifully. Now, there is going to be financing for climate change. We're now working to try to figure out how we can get to the literally trillions of dollars a year that we're going to need to finance all the activities to protect our planet. This is an enormous opportunity for the agriculture community. We can make so much progress if we work together to get this triple win. And we need more research, and I know that many of you are involved in the research, and there are very specific things that we need to work on: increasing yields, boosting resilience, raising the micronutrient content, reducing the environmental footprint. A lot of things we can do. But I would argue that at this time, in addition to building the partnerships that we need, we have to build the partnerships across many different realms. And I actually think we have to go back and listen to the words of Norman Borlaug. Now, I've read a bit about him, and I want to read a couple of things from him that I think gives us a sense of where we need to move going into the future. Now, in 1970, when he won the Nobel Prize, here's what he said. He said, "The Green Revolution has won a temporary..." Can you turn this down just a little bit? The Green Revolution has won a temporary success in man's war against hunger and deprivation. It has given man a breathing space. Now, this was 1970s, so he said man. That I'm just quoting. I'm convinced he wouldn't do that today, reading everything else he's done. If fully implemented, the revolution can provide sufficient food for sustenance during the next 3 decades. But the frightening power of human reproduction must also be curbed. Otherwise, the success of the Green Revolution will be ephemeral only. Most people still fail to comprehend the magnitude and menace of the population monster. Since man is potentially a rational being, however, and he was being generous at that point, right? I'm confident that within the next 2 decades, he will recognize the self-destructive course he steers along the road of irresponsible population growth. So now, if you were to read this uncharitably, you'd say, oh, well, you see, he didn't understand. He used he all the time. He used man. He didn't understand that it wasn't the population problem. It was inequality and social injustice. But here's how I read this. At that time, he did not understand just how impactful the Green Revolution was going to be in actually bringing birth rates down. So what do we know now? Well, people at that time, the birth rate was as high as 9 or 10 children per family. And part of the reason was because infant mortality was so high. Part of the reason was because there was the only social insurance that these families had was having more children. But it was a virtuous cycle, at least partially created by better nutrition, that led to better nutrition, better child survival, more education of women that led to the drop in birth rates. He couldn't have known that his own revolution was going to have an impact on the very problem he was talking about. What he did was he saw the problem in front of him. And it's extraordinary how much time he actually spent in the field with poor people. I have been working in the field myself since the mid-1980s. And he knew that he needed to bring science to a problem. But even at the Nobel Prize ceremony, he said there are more problems out there. And it was the role of future generations of people like us to bring science to that problem. Now here's the other thing he said that I just really loved. In talking about the quote-unquote environmental lobbyists. Look, I work every day with environmentalists. I just want you to listen to what he said. He said, some of the environmental lobbyists of the Western nations are the salt of the earth, but many of them are elitists. They've never experienced the physical sensation of hunger. They do their lobbying from comfortable office suites in Washington or Brussels. If they lived just 1 month amid the misery of the developing world, as I have for 50 years, they'd be crying out for tractors and fertilizer and irrigation canals and be outraged that fashionable elitists back home were trying to deny them these things. What Norman Borlaug taught us with that is that all of us have to have a sense of urgency. We have to look around and understand what the problems of our time are and take action. And for that, I don't think anyone has stated that better than Martin Luther King. This is a quote from his book, Letters from a Birmingham Jail. And this is, he quotes a letter that he received from a white moderate while he was in the Birmingham jail. And you can read it. I'll read it together. The white moderate told Martin Luther King, all Christians know that the colored people will receive equal rights eventually, but it is possible that you are in too great a religious hurry. It has taken Christianity almost 2,000 years to accomplish what it has. The teachings of Christ take time to come to earth. To which Martin Luther King responded, such an attitude stems from a tragic misconception of time and a strangely irrational notion that there's something in the flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time itself is neutral. It can be used destructively or constructively. More and more I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Norman Borlaug has taught us that we have to constantly look for the stains on our collective consciousness of the day. I would argue that childhood stunting, 43% of children not reaching their full potential, is a stain on our consciousness that Professor Borlaug would have approached in exactly the way he approached everything else. What is the nature of the problem? What are the burning issues? What are the moral crises that we can tackle? The second approach was, how can we use the best of science to solve the problem? And I'm not talking about just upstream science. I think we have to do a lot more of implementation science. How do we actually make it work in context? But I think the most important thing that he taught us and that Martin Luther King taught us is that we have to have a sense of urgency that matches the sense of urgency that people feel who can't feed their children. If any of you have known, and in working in Haiti in the mid-1980s, I was born in a country that was one of the poorest in the world. 1959, Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. But I had not been in situations where every day in the clinic I met mothers and fathers who could not feed their children. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, we're in a time now where we can bring the issue of global hunger right to the desks of the most powerful people in the world. Because if we don't tackle it, the existential threats that it could lead to would be something that everybody wants to avoid. You know, let me leave you with this. So my parents met in New York City in the early 1950s. They were among a few hundred Korean people living in the United States at that time. They married in New York City. My brother was born here, went back, and I was born in Korea. In 1959, the GDP per capita of Korea was lower than the GDP per capita of Ghana. And the World Bank at that time said that Korea was a disaster. a basket case, no hope for development, right? They did not give Korea even the lowest interest loans until 1962. The war was over, in the early 1950s. Not until 1962, because they believed that Korea was such a disaster that they wouldn't even be able to pay back a 40-year loan at 0% interest. And the very confident economists of the World Bank Group at that time went on and on about how there's no entrepreneurial spirit, there's a fundamentalist Confucianism, there's no way they're going to develop. And then about 10 years later, they said, well, it's great because the Confucianism is really driving growth in this country, right? But the point is, everywhere I go, countries, leaders, people ask me, how can we do what Korea did? We may not be able to do what China did, they're so big. We may not be able to do what Japan did because they had high literacy rates in the 1890s, but we can do what Korea did. Every single person in the world, most of whom have access to smartphones, know how the rest of us live. Everyone in the world wants to have the experience of being born in the poorest country of the world, coming to Muscatine, Iowa to grow up, and then becoming the president of the World Bank. We, together with you, can make that happen. We must make it happen. Thank you.
President Kim, whoa. Oh, yeah.